We had planned the camping trip as a last hurrah before the Pacific Northwest was swallowed by the cold grip of winter. The trees were still aflame with the reds and oranges of fall, their leaves littering the forest floor in a vibrant patchwork. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and pine. For a postman like me, Kurt Rambo, who spent most of his days navigating San Francisco's chaotic streets, it was a much-needed escape. I brought my dog, Sparky, a wiry terrier mix who was as tenacious as he was curious. Along for the trip were my childhood friends, Laura and Peter. We'd set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering firs and cedars. The first day had been perfect, hiking through trails, swapping stories, and laughing around the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. The snow came that night, a surprise even for autumn. It was light at first, a soft dusting that added a surreal beauty to the landscape. But by the next morning it had grown heavier and the temperature had dropped sharply. As the day wore on, something felt off. Sparky was restless, pacing the edge of the camp with his ears perked. Peter joked that he was chasing ghosts, but even Laura, who never spooked easily, seemed uneasy. I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the woods. San Francisco had taught me to be wary of people, not the wilderness. The first sign of trouble came when we stumbled upon tracks during an afternoon hike. They were large, like a deer's, but elongated, with toes instead of hooves. Sparky growled low in his throat, the hackles on his back rising. "Maybe it's a cougar," Peter said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tracks circled our camp in erratic loops, vanishing into the dense underbrush. By nightfall, the snow was falling steadily, muffling the sounds of the forest. We sat around the fire, trying to shake the unease. Sparky refused to settle, staring into the darkness with a low whine. I tried to reassure him, but the feeling of being watched was growing unbearable. I kept a hatchet close, just in case. It was Laura who saw it first. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes locked on the shadows beyond the firelight. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Peter and I followed her gaze, but all I saw was the dancing shadows cast by the flames. "What?" I asked, my voice more annoyed than I intended. The tension was getting to me. "There was something out there," she insisted. "It looked like a person." We all fell silent, straining to hear past the crackle of the fire. A branch snapped in the distance, followed by a soft rustling. Sparky barked sharply, his leash taut as he lunged toward the sound. Peter grabbed his rifle. "I'll check it out," he said, but I stopped him. "Stay here," I said. "If it's an animal, we don't want to spook it." The three of us stood by the fire, scanning the shadows. Then we heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, calling my name. Kurt. It wasn't right. The cadence was off, too slow, like someone struggling to mimic human speech. Laura grabbed my arm. "Don't go," she said. That's not normal." Before I could respond, Sparky slipped his leash and bolted into the woods. I cursed and ran after him, the others close behind. The snow made the going slow, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. I called Sparky's name, but there was no answer. We found him near a small clearing, barking furiously at something I couldn't see. Then the smell hit me, rotting flesh, sour and cloying. I turned my flashlight toward the trees and froze. It was standing there, half hidden by the trunk of a fir. Its form was wrong, elongated and skeletal, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's, but there was a terrible intelligence in them. It opened its mouth, and the voice came again, this time louder. "Kurt." I grabbed Sparky and backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The creature stepped into the light, revealing hands tipped with claws and a face that looked almost human. Almost. Laura screamed and Peter fired his rifle. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, vanishing into the trees. We ran back to camp, hearts racing. Sparky barked nonstop, his body trembling. The creature didn't attack again, but we could hear it circling, its voice echoing from different directions. It was playing with us. We knew we couldn't stay. Packing quickly, we doused the fire and slipped into the woods, moving as silently as we could. The snow absorbed every sound, but the creature's presence was always there, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. Laura was the first to falter, her foot slipping on a hidden root. Peter helped her up, but the noise seemed to draw the creature closer. We saw its outline again, just ahead, and ducked into a thicket, holding our breath as it passed. Its stench lingered long after it disappeared. After hours of navigating the dark, snowy forest, we finally reached the road. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a kindly older man, took one look at our faces and didn't ask questions. We piled in, Sparky curling up on my lap, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what we encountered in those woods. I'd never heard of a skinwalker before that night, but I've since learned they're creatures of Navajo lore, shapeshifters said to be witches who can take the form of animals or people. Whether that's what it was, I can't say. All I know is that it was something unnatural, something evil, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. We decided to hike the Catskills one weekend in late April. Spring had arrived in New York State, and the forest was coming alive after a long, bitter winter. The air was crisp and earthy, the kind of scent that only comes with thawing soil and budding leaves. It was perfect hiking weather. Calm skies, mild temperatures, and trails framed by the first flush of green. I had come along with 3 friends. Mike, a quiet guy with an encyclopedic knowledge of wildlife. Ellie, who could make even the dullest moments exciting. And Jake, who insisted on carrying his camera to document the adventure. My dog, Buddy, a stocky mutt with floppy ears and an endless reserve of energy, rounded out the group. For someone from Seattle like me, David Starsky, the East Coast forests felt different. They lacked the towering evergreens and constant drizzle I'd grown up with, but they had their own charm. The Catskills were dense with maples and birches, their pale trunks weaving a maze around us. Birds sang in the canopy, their calls sharp and cheerful in the stillness. We spent the morning trekking up a winding trail that led to a rocky overlook. The view was stunning, rolling hills stretching to the horizon, the kind of scene that made you forget your legs were sore and your pack was too heavy. After lunch, we descended deeper into the woods, veering off the marked trail in search of a rumored waterfall Jake had read about online. That's when things began to feel off. At first, it was subtle. Buddy, usually fearless, started hesitating, sniffing the air with his hackles raised. The birdsong quieted, leaving an eerie stillness that seemed unnatural. Ellie joked about it being a scene from a horror movie, but her laugh was nervous. We found the waterfall, less impressive than we'd hoped, and decided to set up a small camp nearby for a rest. Jake started a fire while Ellie rummaged for snacks. Buddy kept circling the area, growling softly at the trees. I tried to calm him, but his unease was contagious. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long and thin. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Buddy barked furiously, his body stiff with tension. Jake froze, his hand halfway to his camera. "What was that?" Ellie whispered. The growl came again, closer this time. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. I'd heard both during my hikes in Washington, and this was different. Deeper. Meaner. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack, my heart pounding. Then we saw it. A massive figure moved between the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the fading light. It was tall, taller than any man, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its movements were unnervingly quiet for something so large. "Maybe it's a moose," Mike suggested, though his voice betrayed his doubt. The figure stepped closer, and the firelight caught its eyes, reflective, amber, and filled with something that wasn't animal instinct. It was worse than that. It felt like malice. Before we could react, it lunged. Buddy barked and leapt at it, but the creature swatted him aside with terrifying ease. Ellie screamed, and Jake dropped his camera, fumbling for the flashlight in his pocket. I swung the hatchet more out of desperation than strategy, but the creature was too fast. It knocked me off balance and grabbed Mike, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed briefly, then were swallowed by the silence. We didn't think. We ran. The forest became a blur, branches slapping at my face as we stumbled through the underbrush. Buddy, limping but determined, stayed close to my heels. Jake and Ellie were ahead, their breaths ragged and panicked. We stopped only when we reached a clearing, our lungs burning and our legs trembling. The fire was long forgotten, left smoldering back at the campsite. Ellie clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" she gasped. I shook my head, unable to answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Then I remembered something I'd read years ago in one of those trashy tabloid magazines you find in waiting rooms. The Catskills were rumored to be home to Bigfoot, or Sasquatch as the locals called it. I'd laughed it off at the time, but now Jake's flashlight flickered, its weak beam cutting through the gloom. "We need to keep moving," he said. "It's still out there." The creature's howl confirmed it. A bone-chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It was hunting us. We moved as quickly as we could, sticking to the direction we thought would lead us back to the trailhead. Buddy whimpered occasionally, but he stayed close, his loyalty unshaken despite his injuries. The forest seemed endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent our hearts racing. Twice we thought we saw it, just a fleeting shadow, a hint of movement, but we didn't stop to confirm. When we finally stumbled onto a dirt path, it felt like a miracle. The village wasn't far now. We could see the faint glow of streetlights through the trees, a beacon of safety. The creature didn't follow us past the tree line. Maybe it feared the lights, or maybe it was satisfied with its catch. I don't know. We reached the village, shaken but alive, and found help at a small diner. No one believed our story, of course. They chalked it up to stress, to wild imaginations and the tricks of the woods. But I know what we saw. We never found Mike. And I'll never step foot in those woods again. Damian Smith always had a thing for road trips, especially when the air turned crisp in the fall. This time, his destination was Louisiana, a state with its own brand of charm and mystery. He'd loaded up his old Ford Bronco with supplies, his toolbox, just in case, and his dog, Shadow, a wiry mutt with an oversized personality. Miami, where Damian lived and worked as a postman, didn't offer much in the way of seasonal changes, and he was looking forward to a landscape painted in oranges, reds, and yellows. He hadn't planned much beyond a few nights of exploring back roads and enjoying the peace of the bayou. The trip started off smoothly enough. He'd driven through towns so small they didn't seem to have a stoplight, let alone cell service. The rain had started on his second day, a slow drizzle at first, then heavier, painting the world outside his windshield in watery streaks. It was the kind of rain that clung to everything, soaking the earth and turning dirt roads into mud traps. By the third evening, Damian found himself parked at the edge of a swamp near an old wooded area. The rain had lightened to a steady patter, and the air smelled thick with damp earth and decaying leaves. He'd set up a small fire to dry off and warm up. Shadow curled up at his feet. The forest seemed alive with noise, croaking frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of unseen critters. It was peaceful in its way, though Damian kept a hunting knife close. You never knew what might come sniffing around in places like this. He was midway through poking at the fire when Shadow perked up, ears alert, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Damian paused, his hand frozen over the flames. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, scanning the tree line. At first, there was nothing. Then he caught it. A flicker of movement in the shadows, too fast and too big to be a deer. His heart thudded in his chest as Shadow's growls grew more insistent. Damian grabbed his flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of eyes, yellow, glowing, and far too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew. Then they were gone. Probably a bear, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. He'd seen bears before. This wasn't one. The next hour passed tensely. Shadow refused to settle, pacing near the fire and barking at every rustle. Damian finally decided to pack up and move. Something about the woods felt wrong, like they were watching him. As he loaded the Bronco, he heard it. A sound so guttural and low it made his skin crawl. It wasn't a growl exactly, but it came from deep in the forest. Shadow whined and bolted into the back of the truck without needing to be told. Damien climbed in, slamming the door just as something heavy hit the side of the Bronco. The whole vehicle rocked, and Damien's breath hitched. He for his keys, but his hands were shaking too much to fit them into the ignition. Another impact followed, this time at the rear. Shadow barked furiously, and Damien finally got the engine roaring to life. He threw the Bronco into gear and peeled out onto the muddy road. The thing followed. At first, it was just a shadow in the rearview mirror, moving on all fours with an unnatural speed. Then it rose onto two legs, its silhouette horrifyingly human-like but distorted, long arms, a hunched posture, and a head too wolfish to belong to a man. Damien couldn't make out its face, but he didn't want to. The stories he'd heard growing up about Louisiana's swamps came flooding back. People whispered about strange creatures out here, things that were part man, part beast. He hadn't believed them until now. The Bronco fishtailed as Damien pushed it harder, the tires struggling against the wet, slippery road. The creature kept pace, its glowing eyes a constant reminder that he wasn't outrunning this thing. Then came the worst sound, a thump on the roof. Damien slammed the brakes, sending whatever was up there tumbling forward. He didn't wait to see where it landed. The moment he saw an opening in the trees, he veered off the road and into the forest, branches snapping against the windshield. The Bronco eventually bogged down in the mud, and Damien knew he couldn't drive any farther. He grabbed his knife, a flashlight, and the old tire iron he kept under the seat. Shadow stuck close as they moved through the woods, the rain now a cold drizzle that soaked through his clothes. They didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of a small village, its dim lights visible through the trees. He didn't remember much of how he made it there, only the sheer panic that pushed him forward. Shadow limped beside him, his usual energy replaced by exhaustion. In the safety of the village, Damien finally allowed himself to breathe. He told a local what had happened, and though they listened with a grave expression, they didn't seem surprised. "Sounds like you met the Rougarou," the man said, using the old Cajun word for what Damien now understood to be the Dogmen, a creature of swamp lore that was said to stalk these parts. Damien didn't respond. He just sat there, dripping wet and shivering, his mind replaying the night's events. One thing was certain, he wouldn't be venturing into Louisiana's woods again anytime soon.